How can your 6-year-old be so childish? That was the joke that a person shared with me a few days ago, over the last few days of Thanksgiving holidays. I've heard a couple different things I thought to share. There was a pattern of people talking about the cruelty of other people. How can children be so cruel? How could Nazis be so cruel? How could... I think those were the two primary examples. We were talking about various... This isn't a party. We were talking about various racial prejudice. And kind of just conflicts like between the Jews and Palestinians, where there could be cruelty in both directions between the Nazis and the Jews. Perhaps there's cruelty more in one direction than another. In the case of the Navajos and the American settlers, in the case of the U.S. military invading Mexico, which eventually became Texas and Arizona and California, New Mexico, so on. In My Lai in Vietnam, kind of a famous example in modern times, a few decades ago, the American soldiers were documented as to some of their activities, so that was somewhat recent. You have things like the beating of Rodney King. How can people be so cruel? How can people be cruel at all? And even children. And so this contrasting joke was, can you believe how childish your 6-year-old has been? And this was said to a parent who was commenting on their own 6-year-old's behavior by the grandparent of the child and the parent of the person complaining about the younger child, the young child. So anyway, how can humans be so cruel? And basically, it's the same way we grow fingernails, and the same way as children that we taunt each other. It's the same way that we get insulted. It's automatic. Consciousness and maturity are also, we could say they're automatic too, but they're distinct from, or we could say, as regard to cruelty, in contrast with cruelty, mercy and sensitivity and so forth, those are also automatic. So they're just contrasting things. It's not cruel to drop a bomb on civilians or a boat full of soldiers, or what do you call it, sailors. Maybe they're naval sailors in a military context. We don't consider that cruel. But to be able to look someone in the face and slowly, be with them as they're experiencing pain. Well, I think about during the delivery of a baby, during a surgery, during after an accident. There's lots of situations where we're present to someone's pain, and if we, as humans, are intentionally inflicting pain on someone else, like in shock, electric shocks, that's quite a distinct thing. But that last reference, I wasn't planning to make this reference, but that last reference reminds me of the experiments of Stanley Milgram, Milgram, and in the, I think it was the 1950s, he was doing research on how could humans be so cruel. And the short version of his research was obedience to authority, where there was a dynamic of dependency, dynamic of control, bureaucracy, more lots of words we could use, hierarchy. It was very easy for in this case, Americans, not all college students, but I think a lot of these were. A lot of the people tested originally were college students in the Princeton and Yale areas of New England. Those studies being done by those near those universities, and where Stanley Milgram was a professor of psychology, I believe. So basically, when a person in a lab coat came in and say, "Here's what here's what we want you to do," shock this person all the way. Here's the parameters, and you're going to shock this person if they get the answers wrong, and here's how it goes. And a large percentage of people, they did a bunch of variation on the experiment, men compared to women, younger people compared to older people, all sorts of variation. But in a huge number of the experiments, people went all the way to administering what they thought they were doing was administering shocks to people who had actually stopped responding. They had, said, "I have a heart condition. I have a pacemaker." They were screaming, and after the screamings, after there was no response coming, and we would presume that the person was unconscious, they would still administer shocks. And these experiments have been more or less repeated in more recent years and filmed, and you could probably find on YouTube or PBS or something documentaries about obedience to authority and cruelty and humans. We are an interesting bunch. It is automatic as growing fingernails or facial hair or puberty or being hungry or breathing that we are cruel, and similarly automatic when exposed to certain kinds of education, certain kinds of interdependence and personal responsibility, when there are clear consequences established for us, we may be much less cruel or not cruel at all. But wherever we move the spectrum of norms in society, then we'll start to be concerned if someone raises their voice, not just if they're beating their wives and children, but if they're raising their voice to their wives and children. Are they using explicit threats of violence? Are they using explicit threats of punishment and withholding? And what do we consider normal? The range of normal moves from culture to culture, society to society, person to person. If you expect the same behavior out of a 6-year-old once they've grown up to be 16 years old, or once they've grown up to be 26-year-old, that would be really odd. Like, you expect a different behavior from the same person. We, behave differently over the course of our lifetimes in different situations, and just as we mature. And one of the things that I've commented a lot on is just this basic psychology. That's true all of the time. But trends of social psychology, where we can look at cultures and economic groups, political groups, and predict the kinds of deviance or deviant behavior that would be predictable. There's going to be deviant behavior in any sample, any group. Whether it's a group of birds or a group of humans, there's going to be a certain amount of deviation if you have a big enough sample. So where's the deviation that we're going to call cruelty or evil or, rude or impolite or whatever terms we would use? Well, it's on the other end of the side from what we would call enlightened or diplomatic or polite or whatever else we might say. We might also say that cruelty happens to go along with desperation, whether that's economic desperation or some other kind of like emotional or psychological desperation, conceptual, intellectual, whatever, somebody desperately defending their political party or their religious affiliation or something like that. All right, so how can humans be so cruel? Stanley Milgram's research gets into that. If you have any further interest in it or anything else I've talked about, feel free to reply or research it yourself.